Hello and welcome to another episode of the Phosphorus Live podcast. So today we have Chris CPAT Pattison joining. I know Chris from the cybersecurity community. We just ran into each other at Level Zero, the OT conference in Atlanta recently, and an RSA after that. So Chris is a big champion of the cybersecurity community, an expert in OT, and especially from the manufacturing as well as risk and compliance around those areas. And I thought it'd be good to bring him on to discuss topics around GRC, because a lot of times people forget about uh, their connected devices. Sometimes people don't think about that being part of the overall ecosystem of these enterprises. Sometimes people think about the IT piece, but the OT part gets left out. And so I really think it's good to have this conversation and discuss that. We'll also have some discussion around community, why it's important to be a part of the community, and kind of how to be a good member in the community. So welcome to the show, Chris.
Hey, good to see you, Phil. Thanks for inviting me, and very excited to be here. Just coming off of B-Sides a few weeks back here in New Orleans, and sorry you missed us this year, but hopefully we can get you back down next year.
Yeah, I just have to get that on the calendar ahead of time. So that would have been cool, because I actually think that fell the week that I was in over at B-Sides Transylvania in Romania, I believe.
Yeah, that would be a fun one. I need an
Yeah.
invite to that one. That would be an interesting one. I'm
Yeah.
shocked that Transylvania is big enough to actually have one. That's very cool.
That was fun. Yeah, it was kind of cool because I got to meet one of my friends from Romania that we were connected. I wasn't sure. I knew he was in Europe somewhere. Didn't really know where they lived, and he kind of messaged me before the conference and said, "Hey," so he was actually there at the conference. So it's kind of cool to see him. Always fun to get to see people that you know from, your connections online, the virtual community and the in-person community.
Yeah, we have our fair share of vampires down here in New Orleans as well, so might fit right in.
Yeah, y'all probably have equally as spooky as a culture there as they do around here with the voodoo stuff and all that. And yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. So very cool. It's great to have you on. So why don't you kind of share with our listeners about your background?
Sure. So I really got into space kind of backwards. I left FedEx corporate strategy and moved into global security. And from there, we needed to get a platform stood up. And this is back in 2007, 2008, when GRC was barely a term, I think. And as we started to build it out, and I started working with internal audit more, and we started working with third-party risk management, we ended up building out a significant GRC program that spanned 150,000 users globally, all divisions. And that was really the exposure that got me into the security side. But obviously, with my IT background, after a few years of doing that on the physical security side and being very closely tied to operations, moved over into the information security side and started really building out my strengths in the InfoSec domain. If you go way, way, way back, I originally worked with Bridgestone Firestone in manufacturing. I worked in field operations at UPS as well as Black & Decker as well. So my roots were in manufacturing, and really started to get into the pieces of ICS security, OT security, and that really fascinated me, knowing that's where I originally came from, with PLCs, SCADA systems, and things along that line. So now working back again with another manufacturer, helping them evolve their GRC program, and a big part of that is really, well, I'm glad you have this topic, is adding that OT and ICS security piece into a broader governance, risk, and compliance program for an organization, and some of the challenges and best ways to approach that, and things I've learned over the years working in the OT and ICS space.
Yeah, that's a very important role that you serve, and have that knowledge, because just, my experience with working in a company had OT environments. Sometimes those areas kind of get overlooked. And, sometimes people that run those OT environments for so long are scared of something getting broken, and they don't want to be part of that overall program for around security. So I think that's very important that we're having this conversation, and we need to get more of this going on within organizations to get more collaboration and trust built.
And that's really, if you think it's bad when the security guy shows up to a plant and says, "Hey, I'm here from security. I'm here to help," and the operators start kind of putting their hands up and say, "Wait a minute." When you show up and you say, "I'm from GRC, Governance Risk and Compliance. I'm here to help," and they're like, "Oh God, it's another auditor." They pretty much flee and go hide. But I mean, that's a big part of it that I learned. This is probably 4 or 5 years back when I was with RSA doing a lot of GRC consulting globally as an extension of their sales team. And you really have to put on, and this goes back to my past, you have to have some empathy for these operators. They are usually overwhelmed. They are typically quite frightened of having an outage. Like if they've had a line go down, the cost can be in the millions of dollars. So they are really thinking more about resilience of their operation than they are anything that you have to offer them from a security perspective. So that's typically when I work with folks, I say you really need to focus, talk with those operators first around, ask them, hey, have you had an outage, or what is your biggest fear of an operational outage? Get them to explain to you, kind of what that looks like in their world, and have some empathy for what they're having to deal with day to day. And what you're actually doing at that point is as a security professional, you're gathering data around what that means to them, and it's a cost, right? So if they're telling you, I know there were lines we had at Bridgestone, if they were down, it could be $1 million an hour, right? And sometimes we get chargebacks from the automakers because we couldn't get tires to them in a just-in-time system. That's really the key, is to have those conversations, factor that in, and then you can start to talk to them in terms of, well, here's data we have either from your insurance. Your cyber insurance provider has a lot of data around this. You can find some of this just out, using AI or using, good searches. What happens when a manufacturing outage happens from a cybersecurity failure, and what types of components may or may not cause that, tied to patching, tied to the typical attacks and techniques that we are aware of. And then they can start to tie two and two together. They will start to see, this failure, that I'm used to maybe from a power outage or a line problem. Cyber can actually introduce that risk to me as well, and that's usually a great starting point where you can build that rapport with those individuals if you're approaching it from that risk perspective and how it impacts their day-to-day work.
Yeah, that's some great information. I'm sure just building that trust alone should go a long way to get them to trust you, because you can understand, and also, as you mentioned, losing production and that costing money. Then there's also sometimes the risk of injury in some of those environments. It's not as, if a paper printer jams, no one's really going to get injured unless you get a paper cut trying to fix that. But with some of these manufacturing facilities, it could lead to actual injury, and these people are not only worried about the money, they're worried about injury. They don't want their colleagues to get injured.
Absolutely. And that's in, we've talked about that more in the ICS space, especially in some of our heavier manufacturing critical infrastructure. There is that actual, potential of loss of life in the worst case scenarios. But the other way I've worked to build rapport, and this is key, is right, if you can bring tools into, going back to talking about these operators, and they're typically under-resourced. If you as a cybersecurity professional or a GRC professional can bring in tools that improve their visibility to what they have in their operation, and there are lots of tools on the market yourselves, use that tool to say, hey, let me show you kind of what you have on your floor. Let me provide insights into, some risks that you may not be aware of. And if they find utility in those, right, there are cases where you may even be able to get operations, to fund some of those tools, into things I didn't see before, from maintaining the resiliency of my operation, is another great way to do that outreach. The best tools I've seen on the market, almost have that kind of operator tilt to them, so that if it's helping them, run their operation, and then we're coming in as security professionals to help them harden it, that's always a great way to build that bridge as well, kind of from the people standpoint. And that visibility, I always say in the GRC world, and we talk about this all the time, but if I can't see it, I can't defend it, I can't fix it. It is really the core of any good program, because it only takes one or two of those things you can't see or you're not aware of its posture, and that can end up being the Achilles heel for the whole operation.
So one of the things too is how does it really differentiate when you're implementing GRC with OT environments compared to IT environments?
Yeah, and I think most of us that have been practitioners in the OT space for some time know that there are those potholes, right? The first one is, hey, you need to patch this system. Well, the manufacturer no longer exists, or they've been sold so many times, or in some cases it's just a capital decision. Unfortunately, the general manager or the plant operator isn't getting the funding to replace that equipment, because it's technically end of life, but it's still functioning, and there may be, other places they need to invest in the facility. So that's where the GRC piece really kicks in. What are the other things I can do, improve, from compensating controls, right? So we talk about isolation, of networks and devices. Are there, other controls we can wrap around that to protect that particular device? So they're a lot more, I'd say, just even in the past 2 or 3 years, better vendor solutions around adding those compensating controls, especially for aging equipment. And so that's one challenge that you're going to have to, as a GRC professional in the space, look at what those controls are, be sure that they're understood should you happen to come under a regulatory audit. We'll talk about that in a second about what's going over in the EU. But the second piece of that's the big difference is, in IT, we're very common. It's like, oh, if you get a patch on Patch Tuesday, I want it installed in 48 hours. Well, back to your original statement as we kind of open the conversation is, one, they need to thoroughly test those things in operations, because some of the stuff is so old, it could actually, bring down a piece of machinery and bring down the line. And then their windows, the maintenance windows, and the time they actually have to do that can be 6 or 7 months out, right? It's typically around a holiday weekend or something where, or maybe they're doing inventory. They're gonna have a whole plant outage, and there's a very tight window. So from a GRC perspective, you need to have kind of those controls or patches or how you're going to address those vulnerabilities highly prioritized, because maybe they can only get through 5 of the 10 things you'd like to see them do. Well, which of those controls and countermeasures best protect the operation? Have those discussions again with the operators, that they understand that. And that's the other challenge. You're not going to be able to get these things patched, as we're typically used to in IT, where the hardware may be more current and not have those problems. I mean, there are places, and I know you've seen this too. Windows CE is still running out there. God forbid, there's probably an XP box somewhere buried in somebody's operation. Years ago, this is probably 10 years ago, but I still saw a Windows 3.1 machine running something, and I was a little bit shocked like that was even out there. But they
Wow.
couldn't get the funding, and it's just where that particular operation was, and you're going to have to be flexible. This is where even pure IT security people should get with their GRC team. Let's talk about what controls we can wrap around this, what will satisfy, kind of that regulatory framework, especially if you're under regulatory pressure to get that addressed.
So what are some of the most common regulatory compliance that you see around OT environments in manufacturing?
Well, I think I've only been back in manufacturing for about 90 days, so I had not been keeping up with the regulatory craziness that's out there. But the new NIS2 in Europe has the same penalties financially as GDPR does, right? And it is around information security infrastructure, and how well you're managing to that, how well you're reporting back to the EU when events or things occur. That penalty is up to 2% of global revenue. So imagine you have one facility that has an issue and you have to report an incident. The EU comes in and starts to say, we're doing an inspection because you had this incident, and then they find out you're lacking controls, you're having issues. You are now in the realm of the same thing. If you followed the press, look at Facebook and Google and some of the organizations that got fines from GDPR fines. This NIS2 has some of the same teeth to it. So, organizations I'm talking to, as peers, I'm trying to kind of sound the gong a little bit. There's already some initial registry that has to be done with certain countries and jurisdictions within the EU. Each country has its own site where you actually have to say, I'm running an operation that fits under this type of infrastructure in your country. And then very shortly after that, starting in 2026, and we're already halfway through 25, this is going to start to kick in. So it may be a slow roll, like GDPR took a while before we started to see the fines coming out, but understanding NIS2, how that may already cross map to other regulations you're tracking, whether it's things around privacy or things around NIST or 62443, these other ISO standards out there as well. It's time to look at that, because the penalty, this now has teeth, at least in Europe. And if it's anything like we've seen before, Europe may start this. We saw this with GDPR, and then very quickly we saw states start to bring these to bear here in the United States with some fines. So for us in security, it's good because it kind of brings that stick in to bring the attention, to the board and to the C-level of the organization. But at the same time, there is real financial risk. And, I had discussions with some team members. If you put this on a likelihood, the likelihood of me getting an NIS2 fine is potentially higher than actual breach if I've got decent security posture and controls around my platform. So it is something we all need to look at. And I bring up that example of maybe a minor incident that still only affects one facility. You get it contained. If that's enough to alert the EU that you may have bigger problems, you could be getting yourself on a global fine. So that's really how I'm starting to do the risk management and perspective around this for the organizations I've been talking to and working with.
So so are there
including
any
my
good
own.
resources out there for anyone that's kind of on the GRC side that's just starting to get into OT?
So I know that MITRE now has kind of, they've done the attack framework for operations and operational technology. That is a great starting place to start to look at where these risks could surface. I always point to some of the free resources. The Secure Control Framework, or SCF, has some good, if you don't have kind of good GRC practices in OT and you're just learning about it from an OT perspective, they've got a lot of kind of free frameworks and how you can set up a program from a plan, do, check, act perspective. They have the ability to crosswalk, is what we call it in the GRC industry, right? So I've complied to one standard. What other ones does that apply to? So there's that opportunity to leverage that to start to close the gaps. And typically those are two really good starting places as you start to look at the risk, look at the controls and things you're expected to have in place. And then how does your organization start to, close those gaps either through a primary control. So primary control may be patching. If I can't patch, what's that secondary compensating control? How am I going to deal with that risk? And what you're doing is you're just getting prepared, for your external auditors, your internal audit to come in. But in the worst case, you're really trying to prepare for, a regulator. When I talk about them, they are actual threat actors, right? Because they can impose a fine on me and cause financial damage. So you need to treat them as seriously as you treat any other adversary that's, examining your network.
Yeah, very, very interesting stuff there. So what do I know you more your expertise on OT side, but so how do you see your views on security around IoT? We get into some of the other connected devices. Used to, that wasn't a big deal, but now there's so much connected devices out there outside of OT environments. So definitely something needs to be taken seriously.
It's crazy. It's blending. The environments are blending over, right? You actually see, as some of our vendors have evolved in the controls and things they may have, for our machinery and equipment that's on a plant floor or operating in a plant, that they are actually IoT devices, right? They're not following kind of the things we traditionally had from sensors and capabilities on the floor. So the line there is getting blurred, right? For me, I almost look at OT and IoT in the same realm, because most of these devices have to be connected to networks. Some of them are looking, to be connected directly to the internet. and you'll have a lot of security folks starting to wring their hands and get frustrated, like, oh, nothing should be connected to the internet, and why are we doing this, and kind of the everything has to be air gapped, and those are traditional and still very good compensating controls. But the reality is, you have to understand, going back to the empathy for the operators, if that GM is competing against another plant, and that general manager has to lower his cost, and here comes Schneider or Honeywell or one of our traditional vendors, and they say, I can reduce the maintenance costs on your facility by X dollars, but I'm going to need to put these, highly connected alarms and sensors in your operation. If you're telling the operator that, they're going to probably default because they have price pressure from their competitors to also, all that eventually makes it into price of product and things along that line downhill. So I don't think we're ever going to avoid, I think the days, and we hear this all the time, right? The air gap, the days of the air gap are gone. It is still a very good compensating control for certain situations where it needs to be put in place. But we as an industry are going to have to figure out how to secure and manage these IoT devices as well, because usage is going to go up, not down, and it's just a nature of doing business and having to maintain and run things on the shop floor, because ultimately that's what's paying the
Yeah, it's just
bills.
amazing how that some of those devices get underestimated, just like security cameras. Some people don't realize that those sometimes have default credentials. Threat actors can get access to
Oh
that.
yeah.
And one of the things, not only just like the Eureka, the ransomware group, the Acura ransomware group, that were actually exploited the camera because they can get a foothold in the environment. Then they did like an SMB shared to connect the environment to spread the ransomware. So people got to realize that maybe these devices can't be completely trusted. They need to be secured. You need to change default credentials, practice good hygiene in these devices. But people are looking at that even from the perspective of what's being exposed through that camera. You've got intellectual property, privacy concerns from these video cameras that people don't take in consideration sometimes.
Well, yeah, intellectual property is big. Your best case scenario is the only thing they do is turn it into a crypto miner, and then that's bad. But at least they're not exploiting data. But yeah, so you bring up another thing. I get in a lot of debates. When we talk about compliance, and I typically break the term compliance. I always make sure when somebody brings up that topic, like, what type of compliance are you talking about, right? So we've already talked about the regulatory compliance, and I say that's the C-Sense regulatory compliance, because it's got a dollar value, right? If I fail something, a regulator's liable to come in and give me a fine. That's just another risk, like any other risk of an exploit that takes a line down. There's a cost to it. There's a likelihood it's going to happen. The second C, or what I call little c, is compliance to a framework. You voluntarily, will look at NIST, or you'll look at some of these other standards to just, understand where your program is. It's tied to governance. You're not going to get a fine, if you're not compliant with NIST, but it's a good framework to follow and kind of get maturity of your program and where you're at. The capital C in GRC is your whole compliance program. And this is where I do get in debates with security practitioners sometimes. They say security doesn't equal compliance. Well, in the terms of capital C in your compliance program, it absolutely does. Because to your point, I could have cameras out in an operation, I could have controls out in an operation, and if I'm not testing them to make sure they're compliant with the configuration, the intent of that control to be out there in place, I'm by default insecure, right? Because I'm expecting a control to be operating and it's not, right? That's like, you think the security guard is your control and he's checking the doors, and you find out all the doors are unlocked because it wasn't configured properly. So when you're looking at your compliance program, how are you testing these things? How are you working with your operators at your local sites to validate, make sure these things are running on a periodic basis? And the most advanced GRC programs, again, I know it makes people very nervous to have different pieces of software monitoring and doing continuous monitoring on their platforms, but can you continuously monitor those controls within an operations facility to make sure they are in fact operating as you expect them to? Because if they're failing, you could have a false sense of security and actually be insecure. So when you have compliance discussions, are we talking about dollars and cents, like cents compliance? Are we talking about little c? I'm talking about a framework, my governance, and how I'm managing my program. Or am I talking about big C, like my compliance program? Am I testing things? Do I know everything that needs to be tested? because that capital C can actually impact your organization quite heavily.
Yeah, and I know before we kind of started, we were going to discuss community. So we were getting close to the end, so I figured we could save a little time here to discuss community.
Yeah, and thank you for letting me bring this up. So, we run B-sides here in New Orleans, and we always want as much feedback as we can get. And we did get some feedback that said some people actually felt, that they weren't included and didn't feel like it was an open group where they could talk and learn things. And we did. When we do B-sides here in New Orleans, we've got everything from brand new students to some folks that are just interested in the field. And I think you see that a lot of the B-sides groups, but as practitioners and especially senior practitioners, and I've seen this, we tend to get a little bit into this one-upsmanship and that I'm smarter than you are in this particular area. And what I'm going to challenge, the leaders of this community and the people that are more senior, we really have to look at taking on that mentor role. I mean, Lord knows I'm not in my 30s or 40s anymore. We've got to be encouraging. We've got to bring, if somebody walks up to you and says, I'm not I'm not a technician, but I'm interested in this space, take some time, talk with them, give them some resources, give them your LinkedIn connection. Don't just dismiss them because, they're not ready to go sit down and talk about, countermeasures and controls around what part of the MITRE ATT&CK framework is going to hit OT. I mean, there are plenty of those discussions to be had, but be welcoming to those individuals. And then even between each other, right? I see a lot of that one-upsmanship, and I see debates even on LinkedIn where people just getting pretty vicious about things. And it's like, if you have a countering opinion to something that somebody puts out there, maybe they need some coaching. They don't know, terminology in the space or something new that's come out. We know this is all changing so fast. So my challenge to our OT community, our security community in general is, don't get into one's upsmanship. Don't get into the like I'm the bigger expert than you are. Stop, be curious, is what I always kind of lean towards. Why is this person asking me these questions? Why did they have that wrong? Take that role of the mentor and be encouraging because Lord knows we need all the help we can get. And if we're running people off, that's not doing us any good. And it can be hard for us sometimes because we like to debate tech and things like that. But be aware of your audience, be opening, and we're going to work on improving that at B-Sides New Orleans. And I offer that out to my other B-Sides coordinators out there, and quite frankly, any conference coordinators that are out there.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And then for anyone out there in these communities, lead by example, because a lot of times people that are newer or younger see you doing things. And if it's, not the best habits, they imitate that along with good habits. So if you're doing the right things and leading the right way, then that's going to influence a better community. So I really like
Yeah, I mean,
your concepts that you come up with there.
think about the diversity we have to deal with. I mean, we have people that may be foreign nationals where English isn't their first language and they may not understand the concept. It's a very heavily dominated male community. So when we do have women in technology and women in OT, let's help nurture them and bring them along. And then I used to say, we got to call it out too. We're the ones that are responsible, as experts in the field. If you see somebody that's kind of not being inclusive, not working with somebody kind of in a constructive fashion, say, hey, pull them aside and say, hey, I heard what you said. Why don't you go tell that person directly? Why don't you offer some coaching versus, just kind of those side conversations and the barbs. Like I don't want to go spend my time putting a presentation together, go up on stage and give it, and then get off stage to find out I've got like 10 arrows in my back. Just come up and talk to me. Don't shoot arrows at me. Let's sit down and talk about it and improve the overall community together.
Yeah, that's great advice. You're able to help someone improve their talk because just like anything, I mean, that's one of the things that I do when I give presentations. I usually do like one new presentation per year, but one of the things I'm constantly doing is getting feedback to improve upon that. So whenever you're giving people feedback, you're letting them improve their presentation. Maybe they had a bad resource for that presentation. So anything you can do to help them, a lot of cases people want to like,
maybe AI hallucinated on them. You never know these days, right?
yeah, it's pretty common. So that I could see. So
Totally.
we're down towards the end of this live episode. So is there anything you'd like to share before we close it out?
I think I kind of covered it, and thanks for giving me 5 or 10 minutes there at the end. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. I don't think there's somebody else that's saying that the risk wrangler, but anybody knows me. If you see me with a white hat, I typically wear it to conferences so I can be located quickly. But come up and say hi. Love to talk to you guys about the industry and continue to help everybody grow. And can't thank you enough for getting me involved, Phil. And good to see you again, buddy.
Yeah, thanks, and I appreciate it. That was awesome for you to take the time out to share your advice, because one of the things, you're, as far as I know, you're like one of the only people I know that knows OTGRC. So it's kind of, I thought it would be good to get someone on to discuss that, because there's a lot of folks that know the
It's
security
coming.
side. Yeah, people know the security side of it, but not the GRC, and we need to really look at the whole enterprise as one. So you need to get everything included, just like you have the OT and IoT security. You also need the GRC piece in there too.
Yeah. Well, NIST 2 is going to help. If you have operations in Europe, please go dust that off. That's my final take.
Well, thanks again, Chris. It was great chatting with you, and I can't wait to see you in person again. And thanks everyone for tuning in. So we'll be returning on July 3rd for the next episode of Phosphorus Live. If you hadn't checked out the Phosphorus IoT Security Podcast, you should check that out. We've got an episode coming up next week from someone that's a hardware security researcher. I ran into them at hardware.io last week in Santa Clara, which is a global hardware security conference. They hosted in Amsterdam as well as the
Wow.
US, and that was pretty interesting. One of the people there teaching the workshops prior to the conference was Joe Grand. So they had some really top-notch speakers and top-notch talent there. So for those listening, keep a watch out for that episode with Hash, which is a hardware security researcher, which should be coming out the next episode. So thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks again, Phil.